African Time.
At 5 minutes past 7 Central African Time, let's talk the EU and African Union Summit now. This is underway in Luanda, Angola, marking 25 years of partnership between the two continents and coming as several African nations celebrate 50 years of independence. Leaders are meeting to discuss peace and security, trade, multilateralism, and migration. With us to unpack the significance of the summit is political analyst and strategic risk advisor Marisa Lourenço. Marissa, thank you for joining us, and always great having these catch-up sessions with you. How are you on this particular Tuesday?
I'm doing really well, thanks, Asanda. It's great to be back on the show again.
Great. It's been a busy week and I guess month for the continent. So the EU-AU partnership and the summit marking 25 years of this and 50 years of independence for some African nations. Why is this moment significant for both continents?
Well, I think for both, it's a nice reminder, that, of course, many EU member states, their influence or involvement on the African continent spans centuries, but it shows that we were able to kind of reset these relationships and kind of continue working forward in a different way, that even after these countries got independence, European member states didn't necessarily retreat. They carried on being involved on the continent. And I think coming, today and seeing 25 years alongside 50 years of independence has shown us that the relationship has continued in a different way, but in a much more positive way, where African countries have more agency than they did in the previous relationship with EU member states.
Let's unpack the theme. It's promoting peace and prosperity through effective multilateralism. From your perspective, are the EU and African priorities aligned, especially when it comes to peace and security?
So I think this is a very difficult one because at the moment we find that the EU doesn't appear to have a very coordinated policy towards Africa. And I think this is because it's very focused on its own domestic issues back home. We have some divergence between EU member states. The relationship with the US has also changed under President Trump, and this has created a lot of flux for them. And as a result, again, honing in on these domestic issues means that they focus a little bit less on some of their global partnerships, and this has included Africa. Then if we look at the African continent, there tends to be quite a fragmented and disjointed response. We don't always find leaders on the same page, always able to cooperate. We find them unable even to cooperate among the smaller regional bodies like the EAC. Obviously, ECOWAS, has not really been able to survive all of the regime changes in the Sahel region in particular. So because of all of the fragmentation and all of the challenges politically and with security that are happening within the EU and then within the AU as well, I think it's difficult for individually them to come to kind of a cohesive security overview, never mind sort of reaching one together. And I think we also have to remember that the AU is home to a lot of member states, and this also makes decision making quite difficult.
Europe also supports countries through the European Peace Facility, especially on civilian and military missions. So how do you view Europe's security footprint on Africa?
I think it's definitely waned. It's more sort of involved in kind of peacekeeping missions, but it doesn't have as strong a presence as it would like, or else it operates, or else it supports the African countries that it's closest to with security. But this has definitely brought in challenges. I think the EU member state that's under the most pressure in Africa, of course, has been France, and its influence and its role in security has significantly declined. If we look at a country like Portugal, which still has heavy involvement in its former colonies as well, it sort of provides training support, to individual countries rather than wider continental efforts. And yes, the EU has approved packages of security support to countries like Rwanda when they are in bilateral missions in other countries like Mozambique. But as a whole, this is not usually financing for combat training. It's or financing for when these troops are in combat. It's more for training and support. So I think that security footprint has waned quite significantly.
Let's talk Africa's economic priorities now and how they are high on the agenda. How can the continent ensure its development goals and interests are fairly represented in partnerships with the EU?
So this is a really interesting one because it came up at the G20 summit as well. And basically the focus in terms of economic priorities has been on debt. And we've seen now that at the AU-EU summit in Angola that this theme has carried on. The thing is, this is not new for Africa. It comes up every few years to say that Africa is unfairly prejudiced when it comes to risk premium. And then as a result, it's got high debt servicing costs, which means that it has to divert spending priorities away from other pressing social uh, spending priorities. But the thing is that I think it's difficult because when we speak about these issues, Africa is not a monolith. Different countries have different debt challenges. And what we normally find with African countries is that even though we all kind of operate underneath the AU can't enforce decisions. Individual states can still choose which path they would like to take. And we find, unfortunately, that when it comes to these economic priorities, even when we have things in common, leaders prefer to go it alone. They prefer to work out their own deals. So I think it's good to see, economic issues on the table, but I think the only way to really sort of say, well, how can the EU help us? Obviously, as one of the lenders to the continent, we also need to come up with a cohesive strategy and a cohesive response. And I'm not sure that we will be able to achieve that.
Migration and mobility. Now, let's talk about that. These remain sensitive topics on the continent. How balanced is the EU-AU approach, and does it reflect Africa's priorities as it should?
What I think the EU and the AU will speak about a lot is the need for regional integration to be improved. And the EU, this has been an agenda of, especially Germany around 10 years ago, where it believes that if we can improve domestic economies in Africa, this will actually have the impact of curbing migration because people will not necessarily feel the need to leave the continent if they have enough economic and social opportunities back at home. I still think that the EU does follow this policy, but I think that it's a very difficult topic at the moment, especially since President Trump came in because of his curbing down on migration. I think that the EU itself, many of its member states, politically, it's becoming untenable to have the high levels of migration that it does. So I think this is quite a sensitive topic for the summit, and I'm not sure it's going to be discussed in necessarily the kind of detail and with the kind of honesty that we might see. So far, we've just sort of seen the EU focus on things like the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, and just saying that Africa needs to facilitate movement across its borders to unlock economic growth. But the implication there is that it's facilitating movement across Africa, not outside of Africa or necessarily between Africa and the EU.
Right. So the hosts are Angola for the summit. What does this say about the general regional role and diplomatic ambitions of Angola?
I think for Angola, it's a great opportunity, of course, for the Angolan President Lourenço to sort of position himself not just as a president, but more as a kind of senior statesman. And we have seen him being involved in other regional efforts throughout his time in office since 2017. The most notable one was the Luanda peace process when he was trying to mediate between the DRC and Rwanda. He's also the chairman of the AU at present. It rotates annually, so he's been the chairman since the beginning of this year. So it's sort of a way for him to leave his mark on politics that go beyond the country, for sure. So I think it's also an important moment to show that Angola does have good relations with the West, including with the EU, and that this relationship goes beyond just its formal colonial master, Portugal. It actually extends to the wider EU bloc.
Finally, what are the takeaways that you are hoping will come out of this summit, as well as what lessons we can take from those outcomes in summary?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what if the EU can actually define which infrastructure projects it is mobilizing capital towards, and if any of this financing is actually unlocked. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of summits because a lot of the time they turn out to be little more than talk shops. And I think that this one is coming at a particularly difficult time because, as I mentioned, many EU member states are very focused on domestic priorities because of political changes over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, maybe since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war. And then President Trump coming into office. And this makes it difficult for them to focus on external issues. And then when you look at African member states, again, as I mentioned, the continent is quite fragmented. But I think if we could get clarity on exactly what the EU wants to support, that would go a long way into understanding where is this relationship going to go. I don't expect to receive that, though. I think, again, we will get a lot of bold statements coming forward, again, about debt, about infrastructure financing, about support, about the long relationship that Europe has had in Africa, but I don't necessarily think we will get too much out of it this time around. But it will be interesting, especially if we can look under the Global Gateway Fund. African countries have been identified as a priority underneath that. So it'll be interesting to see if we get any news or updates on that.
And the kind of influence, if it should, on the G7 from this?
That's another tricky one because again, we're coming at a time where both
Marissa, are you still with us? Right, I think the signal there has just gone haywire again, but we're going to leave it there for now. Marisa Lourenço, thank you so much. If you can hear us for your time, the line there just got cut. I think it's a signal. We had that issue earlier in the show. A political analyst and strategic risk advisor sharing her thoughts, her insights on the EU-African Union Summit. It's happening in Luanda, Angola.
Africa, voici Abedi.
Oui, c'est moi.